Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit the like button and the like button, and then maybe subscribe or something. You could unsubscribe and resubscribe, that'd be fun. Just, interact with the video somehow. I mean, maybe even share it, I don't know. Finally in the new house. Ta-da! So I guess I can finally get back to making videos that maybe aren't quite so cranky because I'm not having to listen to constant hammering in the unit next door. So today is going to talk a little bit about some thoughts on alignment and old Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, an actual D&D video. Alignment's been a debatable thing for a long time. I think to some degree a large amount of people kind of maybe misinterpret how to use it. Right off the bat, I don't think it really has to mean the same thing for how players interact with it versus how game masters interact with the concept and their world design. For players, really all it essentially is just a quick way to have a two-note kind of thing on your character sheet to just quickly remind you of, like, oh yeah, this is my character's ethic. So when you're trying to figure out how your character would act upon a certain situation, less so than how you might interact in that situation if you were there. And beyond that, that's really about as far as players have to take it. You can put an awful lot of thought into exactly what chaotic good or neutral evil or any of these sorts of things mean. But, like I said, it's really just a quick little notation just, to serve as a reminder, when you're trying to decide, how your character would handle a bunch of goblin babies or something like that after they're done clearing out a dungeon and discover a goblin nest. That kind of stuff. For game masters, you're taking on the onus of even if you're running a pre-published setting, you still have to put some thought into world presentation, and so you do have to at least dabble the tips of your fingers into world design. And if you're a more experienced or creative dungeon master type, you've at least put some thought into trying to create a setting of your own. And when dealing with D&D, you do kind of need to incorporate alignment into it. I know there's kind of a philosophy of thought of just ditch alignment entirely, so you can, avoid, the ethical hand-wringing that goes over debating exactly what the hell lawful and chaotic or good and evil even mean, not to mention those damn dirty neutrals. But, because of the just sheer fact that you have spells that hinge upon protection or sensing of or against things that are inherently good or evil, and the fact that in like the greater Tellurian of D&D's setting, their little multiverse, how it all hinges upon the outer realms, which are all arrayed in this disc of alignment. You do kind of have to address it. It's an intrinsic feature of what makes D&D D&D and not just another role-playing game that's similar. And I don't know, like, good and evil, the whole real problem with it, I think, is good and evil. And the earliest versions of Dungeons & Dragons, it was just law versus chaos. Your character is evil, lawful, or chaotic, or maybe neutral. However, almost immediately, that started to kind of skew into a thing with their monster design from the company itself, that made law equal good, and chaotic equal bad, and neutral, I guess, still just damn dirty non-committal neutrals. But as time went on, and I imagine people kind of would start to argue with these points of whether or not anything that was predisposed towards good behavior would be lawful. Eventually by the time you get to AD&D, they added the extra layer to create an axis of alignment to pinpoint your alignment on a grid as opposed to just a straight line of alignment from one side or the other. It's kind of like a political compass almost. However, because they used the simplified terms of good and evil, that still left room for a lot of subjective interpretation, because what good and evil means is kind of a little bit different to everyone. I myself am of the philosophy that good and evil are inventions of the mind. They don't exist in nature, and they're unique to humans and other species that have any sort of grasp of ethical empathy, which you do see bits of that in other animal species, especially the more we're actually getting into studying the psychology of animals and not just assuming that they're like non-sentient, non-feeling blobs just for our disposal and all that kind of shit. Law, order, chaos is simple. It does kind of lead into this kind of like almost, I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but there's a definite yin-yang quality to that. Especially with the older interpretation that law was the good version of the establishing of order and justice, and chaos was just randomness and self-indulgence. And then you had the pivot point of balance of neutrality. And then, like adding good and evil onto that allows you to kind of flip things around. And in terms of games design, that's kind of part of what I'm eventually trying to get to with this little rant. But a thing I do find interesting is in terms of like that classic, 3-point order, chaos, balance. I always kind of thought, as just a complete and total non-D&D side note, that one of the things that was interesting about Werewolf the Apocalypse and their spiritual setting about how the universe is all basically composed of spirits that are aligned with, their version of law, balance, and chaos in the form of the Weaver, the Worm, and the Wild, is that they turned their point of balance, the Worm, into something that was corrupt and overly destructive, and kind of shifted more so that law is kind of bad and that chaos is kind of good. And undoubtedly that might shape my own thinking on that kind of stuff when it comes to games. I feel a definitive thing that most DMs should adapt for their world design is that most of the functioning peaceful cities and city-states and kingdoms of your world are probably lawful evil. Most of your, head of merchant guilds, kings and queens, politicians, they should be lawful evil. They're ultimately self-serving, but because of that evilness of the desire for and the accumulation of power, that actually, isn't like, shouldn't be some mustache twirling, Skeletor cartoon bullshit. That's what chaotic evil is for. Lawful evil is what makes civilization function, because in order for them to gather and maintain and hold their power, they actually need some amount of stability and interchange, across the greater global situation of whatever the world they're in, and regardless of how big that world might be in terms of travel times and all that kind of stuff and complexity that you want to put into it. Whereas, lawful good should be actually, in a way, used more for villainy. Because if you think back through history, most crusades or jihads or, large social revolutions of various types that caused an awful lot of death and destruction in people's lives and got a lot of innocent people killed along the way, and all sorts of myriad forms throughout history, going back thousands of years. Those are always started on very lofty ideals, and a lot of which are also fundamentally religious in nature, let us say. And so I feel that you want like the big evil cult leader for your cult in your D&D world that's trying to purge the land of the unbelievers. Well, that's not a lawful evil person. Lawful evil person wants to maintain the numbers of people that they have under their control, and they have less actual incentive to have a bunch of people get murdered in the name of God. Whereas lawful good believes inherently in the metaphysical appropriateness and justice and righteousness of their cause, and because of their lawful bent, they have to enforce this on the population, regardless of like the individual freedoms clause that a lot of civilizations typically will try to have to protect the common folk and all that kind of crap from just all becoming lockstep indoctrinated to things. Not that doesn't happen with people, but yeah, and because like organizations people in general, like, they don't consider themselves to be bad, and you don't get a whole population to support that kind of stuff if you're like openly evil. Like, that's always been, part of the problem about, like, buying into the concept that there's ever been such an actual thing as Satanist cults, and at least in the way that Christians portray them, as like, what exactly are the actual motivations for being in on that, outside of like idiots who are just basically using it as a dressing for having orgies. Like, there's no real reason to be having bloodbaths and ritual sacrifice anymore. Whereas, people will just unleash an awful lot of damage by thinking that God is on their side and that they're doing something good. They're working for the greater good. Maybe that could be the way of thinking. The distinction between lawful good and chaotic good is about, the individual person acting upon their own initiative and their own, personal feeling about things as to how they're going to behave, and only worrying about whether or not their soul is pure. Whereas lawful good has to have the entire society be good, and be damned the consequences for those who aren't on board with how their particular version of faith wants things to pan out. And like I said, lawful evil is really going to be more like your emperors, your kings, your queens, your barons, leading knights, guild masters, ship captains. I mean, they're all out to make a buck for themselves and gain power for themselves, but because they're lawful, they need a stable society in which to gather more money and power. So like I said, if you want to have the cartoony, yeah, I'll get you next week, blah, 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 kind of a villain, that's go with your chaotic evils. And, just go from there. Like I said, just alignment, unfortunately, is kind of built into the creature. Who knows what the fuck D&D Evolution is going to do with it? I certainly know there's been chatter over many years about D&D trying to get rid of alignment. They've certainly de-emphasized it a lot in 5th edition. I mean, like, like each alignment in the chapter that describes alignments maybe gets what, like a sentence or two. And in a weird way, I kind of think that's not entirely inappropriate, especially for the players. Because like I said, it's really just like, how's my character gonna, like, react to this? Well, they're good, or they're neutral, or they're evil, and they like the law, or they don't like the law. And then on that little crisscross, you could pinpoint yourself on a little mental chart in the moment to decide how your character's going to handle whatever. So anyway, I guess that's about it. All the things, description box below, yada, yada, yada. Stay waspinated. And, I don't know, turkey stuff.